Well, welcome back, class. Yesterday we talked about the differences between the Union and the Confederacy and how these differences divided the nation. Well, today we will be discussing the strengths, the weaknesses, and the leaders of the Union and the Confederacy. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, let's start with the North. The North had a major advantage in population, with almost 4 times as many free citizens as the South. This meant a larger pool of volunteers to fight in the war, as well as more people to grow food and work in factories producing supplies. Industry was the North's greatest strength. Before the war, Northern factories produced over 90% of the nation's manufactured goods. When the war began, these factories quickly shifted to making weapons, ammunition, uniforms, and other essential supplies for the Union Army. The North also had a vast network of railroads, controlling over 70% of the nation's rail lines. These railroads allowed them to efficiently transport troops and supplies, giving the Union a critical logistical advantage. Additionally, the North had a powerful navy and a large fleet of trading ships. This allowed the Union to blockade southern ports, cutting off the Confederacy from trade with Europe and limiting its ability to acquire weapons and resources from abroad. Well, now let's talk about the South. The South had a different kind of strength. They had the determination and motivation of its soldiers. White Southerners believed that they were fighting a war for independence, much like the American Revolution. They saw themselves as defending their homes, their way of life, and their rights. This gave Confederate soldiers a strong sense of purpose and a willingness to fight fiercely. Another advantage of the South had was its familiarity with the land. Most of the fighting took place in southern territories, and the Confederate soldiers knew the landscape well. They used forests and hills for cover, and friendly civilians often guided them along little-known paths to avoid Union forces. This gave Southern troops an edge in certain battles, as they could move more easily and launch surprise attacks against the invading Union army. Now let's talk about some of the weaknesses of the North. We just got finished talking about the strengths of the North and the South, so let's focus on the weaknesses of the North and the South. So the North, despite its advantages, faced several challenges. To win the war, the Union had to conquer a vast area of land and bring the rebellious Southern states back into the Union. This meant invading and occupying unfamiliar territory, which made supply lines long and vulnerable to attack. Northern soldiers often found themselves in hostile environments where local support was lacking. Additionally, while the North had a large population, not everyone supported the war. Some Northerners, known as Copperheads, opposed the war and even sympathized with the South. Lincoln had to work hard to maintain public support and keep the war effort moving forward. Now, the South, or the Confederacy, on the other hand, had major economic disadvantages. The Southern economy relied heavily on agriculture, mainly cotton farming, and lacked the industrial base needed to produce weapons and supplies. Unlike the North, which had numerous factories, the South had very few, making it difficult to equip its soldiers with what they needed. Transportation was another weakness. The South had far fewer railroads than the North, and those that did exist were often not well connected. This made it difficult to move troops and supplies efficiently. Confederate leaders struggled to provide their armies with food, ammunition, and medical supplies, especially as the war dragged on. The Confederacy also suffered from severe inflation. To fund the war, the Southern government printed paper money, but it printed so much that the currency became nearly worthless. By 1865, a single Confederate dollar was worth only 2 cents in gold. Prices skyrocketed, making basic goods like food and clothing incredibly expensive, especially in cities like Richmond, Virginia. Now, at the start of the war, some Northerners questioned whether Abraham Lincoln was the right man to lead the country. He had little experience in national politics and even less in military matters. However, Lincoln quickly proved himself to be a strong and determined leader. He was patient, strategic, and willing to listen to advice from his generals and advisors. Lincoln was also known for his ability to stay calm under pressure. His sense of humor and ability to handle criticism helped him navigate the challenges of leading a divided nation. When his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, called him a fool, Lincoln responded with his characteristic wit. He said, and I quote, "Did Stanton say I was a fool? Then I must be one, for Stanton is generally right and always says what he means." End quote. One of Lincoln's greatest strengths was his ability to communicate. His speeches, including the Gettysburg Address, inspired the Union and reminded Americans why they were fighting. His leadership kept the North united even during difficult times when the war seemed unwinnable. Now, down south, you had Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy, and he had more political and military experience than Lincoln. He had attended the United States Military Academy at West Point. He had served as an officer in the Mexican-American War and later worked as Secretary of War under President Franklin Pierce. Many people believed that Davis was a natural choice to lead the Confederacy. However, despite his experience, Davis struggled as a leader. He was deeply committed to the Southern cause, but he had difficulty delegating authority. Unlike Lincoln, who trusted his generals to make important military decisions, Davis often micromanaged, spending too much time on small details, that's what that means, rather than focusing on the bigger picture. Another challenge Davis faced was uniting the Southern states. While the Confederacy was fighting for independence, its government was weaker than the Union's. Southern leaders valued states' rights, which made it harder for Davis to enforce national policies and keep all the states working together. This internal division weakened the Confederate war effort. Ultimately, while both Lincoln and Davis were dedicated to their causes, Lincoln's ability to adapt, unite people, and make difficult decisions under pressure gave the Union a critical advantage in the war. Well, that's all we have for today. When we next meet, we will be discussing the military, strategy, and weapons. Now, don't forget, the past shaped today, but you shape tomorrow. Make it count. You guys have a good one. See you next time. Bye bye.